tomorrow will not be perfect, and it may be worse in some ways. But if we have a sense of the protopias to come, and having those visions of futures, of what they look like, and asking ourselves, what is it that we want? We are more likely to get there than not.
Humanity is at perhaps one of the most pivotal moments in human history, that our generation will be remembered as the generation that worked throughout this pivotal moment in history.
So look, we have climate change, artificial intelligence or machine learning, synthetic biology, bioengineering. And probably the fourth one is kind of colliding superpowers that literally work at a global footprint. So this is the US and China. So how we decide to navigate all four of those is unbelievably important, and why I say this most pivotal role for us is to decide how we navigate what I call the intertidal between what was and what will be, because all four of those have unbelievable downrange effects and planetary effects. If over the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years, we get these things right, we have the ability to become not only flourishing at the country level, but at the species level, on a planetary level, and on a beyond planetary level.
Nuclear war can happen. Nuclear bombs are still being developed. A war between superpowers can emerge. That doesn't mean that that's the only thing happening.
How do we build a world that allows for the maximum flourishing of the individual that doesn't come at the expense of any other individual, or at the expense of the planet and the ecosystem, and importantly, at the expense of future generations?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of Through Conversations podcast, where we explore the truth through conversations with the most brilliant minds. Today, I am joined by a very brilliant mind, Ari Wallach. Ari, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I'm very honored because you have such an amazing background story. You've worked for 20 years consulting the world's biggest companies and organizations, CNN, the White House, the UN, but also you have this origin story that I really love, which is, surrounding, your roots, your ancestors, which really do influence the way you see the future. And so I'd like to start with that. Your parents were born during World War II, perhaps one of the darkest periods in human history. So, and yet your dad had a very different path than your mom.
Yes.
But what life lessons did you learn from your parents that made you commit to yourself to thinking and working for a better future?
So first of all, thank you for having me. The reality is when I meet folks and they're like, "Oh, you're a futurist. That means you're always thinking about the next 50 to 500 to 5,000 years." And they think I have mirrored glasses on, and I'm just, that's it. I'm thinking about Buck Rogers and the year 3000. But for me, the reality is my work as a futurist is very much, as you alluded to, based in the past as a way of kind of understanding where we are in this moment and how we move forward. So my father was born in 1922 in a small city in then Poland, and as a late teenager, World War II started, and relatively quickly, his city was overrun, and soon thereafter, most of the Jews, actually all of the Jews in that entire city of Baranovich, were placed into a very small ghetto. And after about a year and a half, 2 years, he was able to escape and join the Jewish underground. And he went from post-war Europe. He was a semi-professional soccer player. He worked with the Russians and the Americans to kind of help find former Nazis. And he eventually was arrested by the Americans for basically smuggling Jewish orphans to then Palestine, pre the state of Israel. He eventually made his way to Cuba. He was there for 10 years. He had a significant falling out with Castro because he'd had enough of kind of authoritarian thinking, and made his way to Mexico. Now, meanwhile, my mom was born in 1945. She's a classic baby boomer. It's the end of the war, and the future is bright and wide, and everyone in America is looking forward. She becomes a student of Buckminster Fuller. So I'm moving forward quickly. And working with Buckminster Fuller, I think one of the most kind of renowned thinkers and futurists of the last century, maybe even this one as well, she realizes she wants to broaden her kind of horizons. And so, in the 60s, not like today, broadening horizons, going to live in Mexico for a while wasn't just a nonstop flight. It was multiple flights, no cell phones, stuff like that. She finds herself in Mexico. They're eventually set up on a blind date. They get engaged. married, and I with my 2 older sisters, are born in Mexico. So the reason I tell this story is because when we would sit down as a family to talk about the issues of the day growing up around the dinner table, we usually covered whatever was going on that day, whatever the headlines were. There was always a kind of 150 to 200 year perspective on it. Because my dad was very much always thinking about the past and history and the lessons of history. How did we get to this point? Obviously, someone who came up through and survived the Holocaust was always kind of thinking, how did it get so bad that 6 million plus Jews were killed, plus, tens of millions of others? Now, my mother, having been raised in the bright lights of the post-war America and under Buckminster Fuller as a teacher, was always thinking forward, what could be. So my father, in many ways, was, how did we get here? And my mom was always like, well, where do we go to next, in many ways? And there I was kind of in the middle. So as a futurist, I'm never just focused on tomorrow, nor as a historian or an anthropologist am I just focused on yesterday. I'm very much always situating us on a continuum of where we are, how we got here and how we're going. So it's my origin story, both kind of through my family, illustrates kind of an interesting upbringing in terms of kind of what I'm exposed to, but very much colors in a positive way as a futurist how I do my work.
And it's impressive because your dad shows us that, even though he experienced the darkest moments in human history, arguably, he showed us, he teaches you that we have agency in life. And so how does this theme of agency, even though there's so much darkness around him, influence the way you see how we can build a better future?
I mean, look, we never want to take one person's story and extrapolate it to society or civilization writ large. But in this case, it does inform how I think and how I think we can move forward as a species. To your point, he experienced, his father was killed in front of him, right, as escaping the ghetto. He saw and witnessed and was a part of extremely horrific things. And some people never can recover from that. I don't know. I can't say my dad 100% recovered, but he was the funniest person I knew, right? He was always quick with a joke and with a story. And as far as he was concerned, the way to kind of move through the trauma of what he experienced and in many ways what collective society has experienced is to recognize it, but then to look to the future. So for him, the thing this is Viktor Frankl, right? This is logotherapy. Getting him, he says, through the coldest of winter nights in the forests of Poland, where all he had was a machine gun, he hadn't eaten for 3 or 4 days, wasn't just revenge and survival. That was part of it in the moment. It was also, and he said this till his last day, it was the idea that one day not only would he have children, but he would have grandchildren. It was thinking about how we move forward, again, at his individual layer, but collectively, right? Having children, I still think to this day, is you basically saying you believe in tomorrow and in a future, because no one selfishly would bring something and someone they love so much into a world that they thought was going to be decimated. So the fact that he was so focused on having children and even grandchildren and moving forward was always the most indicative modeling to me of hope and the ability to be an agent for the world that you want to see manifest, as opposed to just saying, woe is me. Now, that doesn't mean everything was perfect, but agency is very much cornerstoned on the desire and the ability to recognize that at the end of the day, regardless of the levels of systemic oppression in your way, you can make a choice. Now, for some people, it's extremely difficult. They are very much locked into systems. And this is not to say that the Western paradigm of the individual hero's journey above all, it's not that. This is not the Peterson approach necessarily. But it's a recognition that at some point you are able to make a decision to move forward. And it may not be the perfect outcome, but that decision, being an agent of your own life, is actually what gets you through the darkest moments.
And it seems as though when thinking about the future, all of us really just focus on the future itself, focus on the next 100 years, the next 200 years. For my generation, it's the next 5 minutes. How can I be, enjoying the next 5 minutes? But for you as a futurist, like you mentioned previously, you have a very strong perspective and unique perspective, which is we have to look into the past to see a better future. And so why is it so important to focus on our origin stories, on the past of our ancestors, our communities, our societies, humanity as a whole, to be able to work on a better future, Ari?
Look, the key question, I think, for us as a species at this moment in time in 2024 is how do we become the great ancestors the future needs? Simple question. It's the subtitle of my book, Long Path. It's what galvanizes me to action every single morning. And so, like me and you and probably your listeners, we want to study the lessons of the past, not be totally beholden to them, but recognizing, A, we're not going to be Pollyannish, so there are some certain path dependencies. We call those mega trends in our world. But the past shows us both what has worked, what has not worked, and the reality of what it means to be a Homo sapien. Look, we have fundamentally not changed that much at a biological level in several 100,000 years. But really in the past, look, for the filming of the show A Brief History of the Future, we were in Spain and we went to these caves that are some of the earliest cave markings known to humans. It's about 50,000 years old. There's both Neanderthal and Homo sapien markings in this one cave just south of Cordoba. And so for 50,000 years at least, we've been telling stories. We've been making markings, right? Fast forward, 10,000 years, we go hunter-gatherer. Then we go Bronze Age. Then 500 years ago, we go Gutenberg. And then today we're in AI. So we've been building tools that have helped us become better at what we do for at least 50,000 years. First tools being storytelling and markings, all the way up to Sora, which just came out, right? Where we're literally being able to put a text prompt in and see video imagery. And by the time this comes out, even if this comes out tomorrow, there'll be another AI advance. And so what history allows us to do is to look at the ancestors that came before us, extrapolate what worked and what didn't work so that we can more intelligently, with greater wisdom, move forward. So that's my emphasis kind of as a historian futurist. Now, you said something very interesting, which is about kind of current generation thinking about the next 5 minutes and TikTok. Another thing that I was exposed to that is altered how I think about the future is in my 20s, I spent a lot of time with the San Francisco Zen Center and at Green Gulch, which was their kind of retreat center in Northern California, very much focused not on mindfulness as we know it today, but very much being hyper present, right? Not in a way that would disconnect me from the past to the future, but so that I recognize that in every single moment, that's the only moment there is. And the reason I bring that up is most people who are thinking about the future, 5 years, 50 years, 500 years, will just think about that. And they won't think about the past, but we've covered that. But they really won't think about the present moment. And why that is so important and why agency, going back to your earlier question, comes up again and again is because that agency isn't just to say, I'm going to build an electric car, or we're going to do monorails or jetpacks or geoengineering. The agency is, how am I going to be a better human today, which makes me a greater ancestor down the line? And that can scale. And what I mean by that is I've met some futurists who do really good prognostications of the next several decades, but they're not actually that fun to be with. They're not warm people. And I'm not calling anyone out, but just in general, if you don't have your internal emotional house in order, and you're, just to use the lexicon of my teenage daughters, if your vibes are off, but you talk about these grand futures, to me that doesn't hold water. How you say hello to someone on the street, what I'm teaching my son, who's growing up, in the shadow of a futurist, and he always wants to talk about technology and all these things. I said, that's great. but hold the door open for the person behind you. That's how you future at the most granular individual scale. If you're having a conversation with someone and you're in a disagreement, how are you conscious of your words and what you're saying in that disagreement? That's how you're futuring. Because it may not seem as at scale as the big futuring things we talk about, a Dyson sphere where we wrap the sun and Kardashev scale and we can extrapolate energy from the sun. That's what we love to talk about in the futuring sci-fi community that I grew up in. But I'll be honest, just as important are those really small things, because those set trim tabs, which is a term we can go back to from Bucky, of what the futures will be like. Because the reality is not all of us, including myself, are in the situation room or on the floor of an AI lab, and we're making these huge decisions. Yes, there are those who do that. And yes, by our actions in the world, we can help influence those for the better. But at the end of the day, for almost every one of us, how we are in the moment, how we are present in the moment, over time, over scale, is what actually will create better futures, right? So I have 3 children. In several hundred years from now, there'll be anywhere from 20 to 30,000 descendants from me and my wife.
Wow.
And so how my wife and I interact at the dinner table and how we talk to each other, and therefore model behaviors for our children, could impact tens of thousands of people in terms of how they are with those people around them. Now, when I say that, people say, well, that's not as important as technology at scale. But if you think about it, yes, the core AI engineers at OpenAI are extremely important to how AI will develop over the next several decades. And at the same time, if you take all of your listeners and they all kind of think about, in the moment, how are they hyper-aware, how are they building futures, those numbers are going to be the tens of millions 100 years from now. So that's how you become an agent and a great ancestors, by thinking about what you inherited, good and bad. And I write about this in my book. I write about this argument in the book, which surprised a lot of people in a book about the future. I got into this argument with my wife about how she put the groceries in the grocery bag from Trader Joe's. And I realized it had nothing to do with that. It had to do with how my dad would get into arguments with my mom, and how that had to do with my dad being probably upset with his mom for not surviving the Holocaust. And so this isn't a kind of new agey way of thinking about it. It's just recognizing we bring good and bad things with us. And it's up to us to kind of unpack that, be present in the moment, and then build out those further futures. And most importantly, to do that for those of us who are in positions to actually be AI engineers or be doing that important work, because that actually has huge downrange impacts. So whether you're a school teacher or, you work at SpaceX at the highest levels, this stuff actually matters.
Listen, I'm trying to be mindful every time I ask ChatGPT for something. I try to say please and thank you. I try to add those values so they can, when they become sentient, they at least know that some of us were trying to, show them the good side of humanity. But Ari, you touched on so many ideas there that I truly appreciate it, are very insightful. We're going to get deeper into A Brief History of the Future, your show coming on PBS later in April. Rather, on April 3rd, so April beginnings 3rd, of April.
Yep. First of 6 episodes starting April 3rd, then every Wednesday at 9 p.m. on PBS, pbs.org, the PBS app, and eventually in North America, YouTube full episodes.
We'll get there, I promise you. I'm excited to talk about that. But you touched on so many insights there in pertaining also my generation that I think we can drill down on is, there is this, at least on my perspective, I keep every year, I tune in into, the big news show where it says, the news report that says we're seconds to midnight on the doomsday clock every day, every year rather. And it clicks, closer and closer to 12. And so when I see that, even though I'm an optimistic person, naturally, I try to see the good in everyone and in myself. I try to, like you've been writing on Long Path, I'm trying to build this golden rule for future generations, which is so hard because I don't have children yet. Hopefully, I'll get there soon. But I see we're seconds to midnight, and I'm just, I feel I'm powerless. That's where agency also comes into place, because I feel that there's not that much I can do to change things. And so extrapolate that to a whole generation. And I think that's a big theme into what we're seeing with the obsession on TikToks and just doom scrolling and just being obsessed with fashion trends, all superficiality, because I think the deeper message is we're getting told that the future is about to end. There is no future. Yeah. And so how can we turn that around when, we can see we're seconds to midnight. Midnight is not yet here, but that in itself can become a springboard into building a better future in terms of future generations. Because I know that for me personally, I keep telling that I see these yearly data sets and I think about the long term as well. But I also doom scroll on Instagram. I also I'm part of Gen Z. And so how can we embrace those values and not to discourage us for the future, but rather build a better one?
A lot to unpack there. So let's start with how we think about what we take in. Because I think first and foremost, we have to kind of go straight at doom scrolling and recognize that, look, many people try to eat as healthy as possible. We try to kind of avoid junk food. And we think about how our food is made. And, is it organic? Was it fair trade? But when it comes to the actual information that we take in that affects us at a neurological level, we don't have the same filters. So we'll scroll through on Instagram or on TikTok things that are mostly full of doom. And we have to remember doom or negativity is a hot emotion that the algorithm will continually serve up because we keep wanting more of it. And that has to do with our brain and our negativity bias. Because, look, we got to the point where Ari and Alex can talk across the internet. We got to this technological point as a species because we knew and we learned, at least those of us who made it on this branch of the tree, to avoid things that were going to kill us, right? So our ancestors 2 million years ago that walked into an open pit of lava, that genetic line is no longer, right? But those of us who looked at things that could kill us, we're here talking now. So deep within us is a bias towards things that are negative because negative things kill you. Now, in this day and age, we don't have the lions and the volcanoes and the tigers we necessarily have to run from, most of us. But we're still hardwired that way. And so when we're doom scrolling, which is, a terrible thing, and seeing these headlines about the world ending in these minutes, I'm not saying don't do that because you want to be informed, but recognize that's a level of neurological addiction akin to refined sugar, right? The reason you and I love sugar and, Haagen-Dazs ice cream is because up until 15,000 years ago, when Ari and Alex were walking through the Serengeti, we didn't know how often we were going to get food. There wasn't delivery by drone of a pint of ice cream. So if we came across a tree full of ripe fruit and sugars, we ate as much as we could because we didn't know where our next meal was going to come from. And that is still within us. And that's why we love that sugar. And so when we're doom scrolling, our brain, literally at the hippocampus and the amygdala, the whole thing actually is going to say, give me more of that negative stuff. What else should I avoid? Tell me more. What else should I avoid? That's the same level of addiction. So first and foremost, to develop an individual agency is, know thyself, not just a psychological self, but know thy brain self and know kind of what it means for us to be holding, these phone tablet devices that are kind of slot machine addiction devices. And look, I have my phone right here next to me, not because I knew I was going to tell this story, but because I'm human. So first and foremost, that's what we have to think about is like, what's coming in? The second thing is a friend of mine introduced me to this really a concept. When she's on social media, she is not constantly, but pretty constantly training her algorithms. So she won't click on those negative stories. She'll, instead of doom scrolling, we like to talk about hope scrolling and training the algorithm. Actually, this is what I like. This is what I want. And this goes back to an earlier comment you made. When we thought about this show, we thought about how it would create impacts at multiple levels. One of the things that came to us kind of late in the creation of the show was the recognition that at some point in time, a large language model will consume all the audio and video of our show. And we are a small drop vis-a-vis Reddit and Twitter and the internet, going to model a way of having a conversation, of being inquisitive, of being curious, of being hopeful, of being compassionate and empathetic, modeling that tonality to a large language model, right? And so this conversation that we're having right now, I guarantee you in no time flat will be ingested. And that probably, for what it's worth, goes for all of our emails and text also at some point in time. So what we consume and what we put out are hyper important. One. Two, we need to recognize that, and this is going to go to a minor point because you raised it, this clock to midnight, which is basically about nuclear war, is still very much a real issue. Like, we focus on, especially in America, on a lot of horse race political issues. Some of them are important, some of them are not important. But if there's anything your listeners take away from this, is like, nuclear weapons are still a thing. Yeah. And they don't have to be. And that's why the Nuclear Threat Reduction Initiative and a whole bunch of things, if you're interested in this, that's actually something you can get involved in. It's kind of a blue ocean right now. No one has picked it up since the end of the Cold War, but it's a real issue. And so from those, things about how you talk to your kids to being involved in nuclear threat reduction activity, like, these are the things that you can do as an antidote to the doom and gloom and dystopianism that is fed to us by algorithms.
Wow. And look, I'm gonna try to hope scroll, because right now my algorithm is either the doomsday or French bulldog. So I'm being fed dogs and doom. So I don't think it's a good combination for the brain.
I'm being fed now hope scrolling and Australian Labradoodles. So
I rather have your perspective on.
Yeah, I've trained it just to show me videos of good things that are happening in the world that are moving us forward, and of dogs like mine. That's what the AIs think of me.
And Ari, here's the thing. That brings me to the next question, which is, and you also hint on it right now, which is, it doesn't mean that we don't need to be informed of what's happening. It's real what's happening. Nuclear war can happen. Nuclear bombs are still being developed. A war between superpowers can emerge. That doesn't mean that that's the only thing happening. That doesn't mean that we have to tune in 24/7 to that story, because, this is the perfect segue to discuss a brief history of the future. There are real people working 24/7 to build a better future. We just need to tune into that story. And so why was a brief history of the future developed by you? I also know that it was executive produced by Drake, which is awesome because, for Gen Z, we love Drake. We love his music. I think most of us love, and not only Gen Z, but he's also been, he's famous for rapping and singing, but I haven't seen him, involved in such projects. And so would you walk me through, a brief history of the future, and also how did Drake come into the equation?
Yeah, I'll give you a brief history of the future. And in some ways, we just touched on this, right? Like, I've been hope scrolling for a very long time. It's my job. Look, I've been a kind of professional futurist for over 20 years, and I'd say for the last 5 or 6 years, I've kind of gone through my own phase change. But up until that, and I'll get back to that in a second, I was always hired by large corporations and governments and financial institutions to think about possible futures that might or could happen, but specifically through the lens of, how do these organizations win the future? How do they take the chaos and flux of this moment and better position themselves vis-a-vis others? Mm-hmm. And in 2016, I had my come to Moses moment, where I realized, like, we can't have a binary way of thinking about the future in terms of winners or losers, at least for myself as someone who is steeped in this work and helping others think about the future. And so it wasn't an ethical crisis, but it was more of an existential moment where I said, okay, for myself, what's the most important? How am I going to be a great ancestor? And that's where kind of long path and long pathian thinking, which is, this idea that we're not just consumed by our own lifespan bias of birth to death, but obviously we're in a much larger chain that we've talked about, past, present, and future. One. Two, we can't think about a singular official future, right? We have to think about multiple futures. Because the official future is usually dictated by someone who wants a very specific outcome. And third, we have to have a much larger goal, a much larger telos for ourselves and for our species and for humanity. And in doing that work in 2016 and kind of pivoting how I think about futures work, it became clear that one thing that was missing was a new story or a new narrative of how we talk and think about tomorrow. So I knew there were individuals out there creating better tomorrows. It was my job to find them. But the more and more I found myself in conversations around the world with other folks, and I would tell them these stories, they'd always say the same thing. I had no idea. All I know is that we're losing all the topsoil, and in 50 years we run out of food. But I didn't know that there were people doing, lab-grown fish or vertical farming, all these things that you'll see in the show. To me, it was kind of, because it's my full-time job, I'm like, oh, are you kidding me? Whatever the issue is, someone's working to counter it. And then I found myself in conversation with our first executive producer, Catherine Murdoch, who has a long history of funding both storytelling in the climate change space and specifically work in the democracy space, but all through a normative lens. So how do we manage climate change, mitigation, adaptation, and how do we bolster and strengthen our democracy? This is all forward-leaning work. So I'd already had the idea for a brief history of the future, but in working with her, we were able to refine it, and that became the bones of what folks will see. Now, at the same time, I was and still am the futurist in residence for an Apple TV show, which hasn't been announced yet. It takes place in the future. And Drake is also, and his company Dream Crew, is an executive producer of that show. Now, that's based on a book, so there's not so much you can wiggle with the storyline, although I think I've been helping. And in one of the virtual writers' room workshops, there's folks from Drake's company in there, and they called me up afterwards, and they're like, you should have a show that talks about these positive visions of the future. And I go, well, as luck would have it, we're working on one. And that's how Drake came aboard. And then we met the philanthropist Wendy Schmidt, who's been funding a lot of work, especially kind of around thinking about the future, thinking about oceans and food and whatnot. And she came aboard. And the final executive producer that just came aboard was Kylian Mbappé, who is one of the world's greatest soccer football players. And what Drake brought to the table early on and still is bringing is, if anyone who's ever kind of really listened to Drake's music or especially been to one of his concerts, he realizes very early on in his own career and up till this day that thinking about how people come together, not through hate and fear, but through love and community, is not only what most of us desire, but what most of us are lacking in a core message. And you see that and feel that in the concert. So his influence on the show at a kind of meta level has been to ensure that when we think about our work, to not slip into the binary of good or bad futures, but to recognize that history brought us here, not always by our choosing, not always by what families we were born into or what countries or what circumstance, but if we have a clear vision of where we want to go to, we are more likely to get there. And it really means being open. Look, Drake is, he's Canadian, he's American, he's Jewish, he's Christian. He kind of always splits between these worlds, and he brings that. And then Kylian Mbappé brought something so obvious, which is his love, obviously, for the sport, but his desire to engage the next generation and engage youth into thinking really critically about the goals that you want to have. His, at a very early age, was become the world's greatest soccer player, which I think he is, if not there, well on his way. But how we bring that down to the ground level. So his work has really been about ensuring that in the conversations that we have throughout the show are always going to be kind of solution-focused and goal-focused. So that's how the show kind of came about. We partnered with PBS here in America for many reasons, one of them being that PBS is free to everyone, right? A very large number of Americans actually get their TV, that goes on to their large televisions through aerial antennas. They're not subscribing to cable. They may not even have broadband access. But in many parts of the country, they do get PBS. So we want to think about how do we build futures for all. We have to make sure not only do who we bring onto the show in as many different kind of diverse perspectives and views as possible, but who can actually interact and consume the show as many people as possible. And the second thing that PBS brings, besides I think probably the best brand in news and information in this country, if not the world, is the ability for them to take elements of the show and break it into curriculum that will then be going in the next several months to 1.5 million school teachers in America. So right now there is no national how to think about being an agent in terms of futures curriculum available free of charge, turnkey for teachers in America. This show will be providing that through PBS. So that's 20 million students thinking about Futures Wheel and telos and what kind of worlds they want to build. And it's nonpartisan, it's non-political. It's really about bringing that sense of agency and in many ways counteracting the doom scrolling by giving them a sense of they have the ability to think about the future less as a noun and much more as a verb, right? That's very much the gestalt of the show and the gestalt of the curriculum. And that's a brief history of a brief history of the future.
I love how you say that the future can be a verb, not a noun. That's amazing. And I think that, in your trailer, in the brief history of the future, you ask this question, which is, when you hear the term future, what does that conjure up? And I want to ask you that question. But before that, I want to say that, our generation, especially I think nowadays, the information we consume, when we think about the future, maybe this is just me projecting myself to the entire species, but it's associated with uncertainty. It's associated with complexity and with not a unified vision, an optimistic vision of the future. It's not associated with, there's something we can look for. There's something we can be hopeful for. We're caught up with the election cycle. We're caught up with, is there an impending nuclear war? We're caught up with, what are my friends doing that I'm not doing in my life, in my career? How can I grow up as a person? All of these things that create uncertainty in an individual level. How can I begin my family? When will I have children? That's uncertainty for me. But couple that up with the whole macro world. I know that you spoke with Emmanuel Macron on your show. That's an interesting poetic thing that I just did there. We can discuss that too. But there doesn't seem to be this, this term, a positive term related with the future as a verb. And so if you want to jump in.
So I'll tell you, so we didn't come up with the term, Kevin Kelly came up with the term, but it's this idea of protopia, right? So we all know what dystopia is, right? In fact, if I go across the hallway and look at my daughter's bookshelves, they have shelves of young adult fiction dystopia, Hunger Games, The Maze, like it goes, the show The 100. Like dystopian thinking, doomerism is rampant as a narrative. And we've talked about why, because it sells, right? So that's dystopia. Utopia, which from Thomas More's really means no place. There is no true utopia. Even when we tell utopian stories, they're actually it's really a dystopia in disguise. It always falls in on itself. So Kevin Kelly, the futurist and technologist, came up with this idea of the term protopia, which means tomorrows that are better than today, but not perfect. So what we try to do in a brief history of the future, and I think we pull off pretty well, is to show protopian visions of what could be by what people are working on today. Yep. So never in the show do we say, oh, the future of food is X, or the future of education is Y. What we say is, here are people who are modeling a way of thinking, protopianism, and doing something about it to get us to better tomorrows. It doesn't mean everything will be perfect. It means it will be better than it is today. And that's what moves us forward as a species. We know this thinking in technology, right? I've already mentioned, we go from writing to agriculture, Bronze Age, Gutenberg, AI, and beyond. So it's very much front of mind how we evolve our external technologies. it's lost on us how we evolve our internal technologies, our sense of self, our technologies, what are actually known as wisdom technologies and our wisdom traditions and our religions when they're at their best, not when they're at their worst. And so what is imperative at this point in time for folks to realize is that tomorrow will not be perfect, and it may be worse in some ways. But if we have a sense of the protopias to come and what our role is in them, and having those visions of futures, of what they look like, and stepping back and asking ourselves, what is it that we want? We are more likely to get there than not. I asked Kylian Mbappé this in this show. I go, when you step up, and you're taking a penalty kick, do you envision yourself missing the goal? And he goes, that's crazy. Why would I do that? If I do that, 50% of the time, I'm going to miss right off the bat, no matter what. And the extrapolation there is, as a society, all we envision is what it looks like to miss, not what it is to win and hit the back of the net. Now, that's easier said than done. History is littered with ideologies about what the ultimate goal should be. And I think, what I take from Karl Popper, and I'm sure you've mentioned this many times, is no one has a monopoly on the truth. And no one has a monopoly on the future. But what we can do is talk about truths through a very kind of logical way and futures through a logical way. And so what we hope the show does in many ways is kickstart a conversation about what futures do we actually want. And by the way, that's at the big macro. How do we want to feed everyone? How do we want to clothe? How do we want to educate? But here's an experiment that your listeners can do or that you can do, which is, if you're not in a relationship right now and someone was to ask you, what are you looking for in a relationship? 9 out of 10 times, do this experiment with your friends. What they're going to tell you is what they don't want. Well, I don't want him to be like this. I don't want her to be like that. We are trained to think through the negative. And so what the show does is it flips that. It thinks about, what is it that we do want? What do you want in a relationship? What do you want in a future? Not a future without nuclear weapons. Yes, 100%. But to get to that point, you have to also supplant the negative with a positive of what you want that protopian to be. You can't just say, I don't want dystopia. That'll only get you so far. That'll only get you halfway there. The next half is to have that conversation about what is it that you do want.
Wow, and I know that your work is hugely influenced by Martin Seligman, on positivity and how to reframe the brain. And I do appreciate you highlighting that we can think positively about the future and work for that. And Ari, you also, in the trailer, A Brief History of the Future, you also mentioned that humanity is at perhaps one of the most pivotal moments in human history, that our generation will be remembered as the generation that worked throughout this pivotal moment in history. And why do you believe this? Why are we right there in that point of history? And, what are the themes working around this idea?
Yeah. So look, these are obvious: climate change, artificial intelligence or machine learning, synthetic biology, bioengineering. And probably the fourth one, which you talked about, is kind of colliding superpowers that literally work at a global footprint. So this is the U.S. and China, right? The classic Thucydides trap and how we navigate this moment. Not saying one will rise or fall, but saying it's real. So how we decide to navigate all four of those is unbelievably important. And why I say this most pivotal role for us is to decide how we navigate what I call the intertidal between what was and what will be. Because all four of those have unbelievable downrange effects and planetary effects. So it's not like 150 years ago, if there was a small skirmish, you would stay localized, right? Or if you crossbred 2 orchids to make a hybrid orchid and something went wrong, you would just stay in that greenhouse. Or if you did a certain level of pollution or CO2, or if you polluted a river, it would only impact locally. Now these are all planetary. These are all species level megatrends or categories and frameworks that we have to decide what we want it to look like on the other side of this intertidal to successfully navigate it. Or else what we'll be doing is we'll kind of be, we know this, is just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Now, this is also a story where the Titanic makes it across, right? My greatest concern, which is maybe the next question you're going to ask, is that we focus on those deck chairs and not on where it is we actually want to go. So we know we want to avoid the iceberg. The fact of the matter is we're already kind of scraping up alongside of it. You can see that around the world right now. But if we don't have our GPS synced to where we want to go, my concern is that we are not only the most pivotal generation, but we may be the one remembered by our descendants as the one that didn't do enough. And by not doing enough, it could lead, and anyone who's read Asimov and the Foundation knows this, to less than light times for decades, if not centuries. On the other hand, if over the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years, we get these things right, we have the ability to become not only flourishing at the country level, but at the species level, on a planetary level, and on a beyond planetary level. Those are all things that we need to do in the next 1 to 2 decades.
And you hinted on my next question, which is related to that in a sense, is that, we've been discussing on how there is not this really an aligned vision of the future. There is not really something we can rally towards. We're very scattered in many ways. And in A Brief History of the Future, you go into 6 episodes. Each of those are a pillar of how the future could look like in technology, sustainability, science, culture, community. And so how are those pillars, or rather, how can we approach those pillars to build that vision, and how does that vision really look like? I know it's a Protopia. I know Kevin Kelly's, spoiler alert, he's going to come on the show soon.
Great.
But yeah, so that vision in itself, we like, how can we rally towards that one vision? So
what we do in the show is, you're right, we look at a lot of these kind of verticals, housing and food and education, but we actually in the episodes do a crosscut horizontally. So the first episode is focused on just our conception of time, beyond the now. So first thing we want to do is kind of expand our temporal horizons backwards and forwards. The next thing in episode 2 is chaos and complexity, which we've already touched on. What is this moment? And what could come out of it? So we think about the struggles of this moment, but we also need to think about the opportunities of this moment. In the greatest, physicists always come back to this idea that in the greatest moments of chaos, we can have a phase shift, or actually chemists talk about this, where a singular or multiple catalysts can reorder to a completely new way of being. Obviously, they mean this for a compound or a substrate. I'm talking about it at a societal level, at a planetary level. The third episode is about the stories that we tell about the futures and who gets to tell them. So we've touched on this. The fourth episode is that what does it mean to be human? And again, we don't put our thumb on the scales here. We look at human augmentation, how we are with each other, how we think about living and dying and lifestyles. The fifth episode is about community. The number one thing I found traveling the world for this show, when I asked people about what are the futures that they would like to see happen and occur, always involved the word community. So it became very obvious that was going to be kind of the penultimate episode. That leads us into episode 6, where we kind of start to think about what these futures could look like. So what the show does is it's meant to kind of open your mind to rethinking how we think about tomorrow, which then leads into your question about what are the futures, not the singular future, because that's a trap. If we say this is what it's going to be like, and that is a trap only based on the historical record. Whenever anyone has said, this is what it's going to be, that's never worked out well for us. So what we have to do is we have to think of what are the multiple futures, but we have to bound it and constrain it. And what that means is we're not Pollyannish. We have to work with human nature. It goes back to the earlier part of our conversation. And we have to think about it almost through a Rawlsian justice. How do we build a world that allows for the maximum flourishing of the individual that doesn't come at the expense of any other individual or at the expense of the planet and the ecosystem, and importantly, at the expense of future generations, right? One of the things we talk about in the show is how we've colonized the future. Mm-hmm. We've taken resources from tomorrow and brought them into today. That is not the kind of futures that we want if we want to be ethical in terms of transgenerational justice and transgenerational empathy, a core part of the book and of the show. And so what the show becomes is a launching pad for individuals to step back, both as an individual, within a family unit, however they define that, within the organizations, at a societal level. This is a lot for a show to ask, and say, where do we want to go? What are the goals? Knowing that those will be iterative. What do we want to be our land of milk and honey, ongoing for generations? And remember, one of the things about that, and ask Kevin Kelly about this, about Protopia, there's no end point. There's no, oh, here's the Garden of Eden, everything's fine. I don't believe in that. I believe for the next several thousand, 50,000, 100,000 years, we will consistently become better. We will become better versions of what this human hardware can become. Will we augment it? Sure. Will we at some point find a way to go, string theory, ultra-dimensional? Maybe. But what's important to me is not that we get to Mars or get outside of the solar system, which is important and an interesting question. The more interesting question is, how do we get there as the best version of Homo sapiens possible? Because if I was to take 1,000 people from planet Earth right now and throw them on Mars, and they just replicated what we had here, I'd say it wasn't worth the jet fuel. But if we actually think about how do we evolve our internal tools, our internal ways of seeing and thinking about the futures that we want, then we're onto something. And that's what the show gets us towards.
Yeah, I've hosted Roman Krishnarik. He wrote the Good Ancestor, and he mentioned, how we colonized the future. So that's the first time I hear it back. Yeah. I'm gonna re-listen to that episode as well. And yeah, it's so interesting because, like you say, we're in this pivotal moment where it does seem like we're just in the cusp of everything. It kind of seems black and white in a sense, to be honest. We can go, extrapolate ourselves going into Mars, but at the same time, ending civilization. And, the overarching theme of this conversation with you, my goal was to, understand that humanity has its faults, but humanity in itself, has its benefits too. Like, we created a new species, which is the golden Labrador. It didn't exist before. Yeah. We can do cool stuff, and we just need that story to tap into. And we also need to highlight the stories of the people who are building, an optimistic future, which, you spoke, Ari, with French President Macron, U.S. Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, French football star and co-producer, executive producer of the show, Brief History of the Future, Kylian Mbappé, and others. And so what are these individuals have in common in terms of how they see the future, and how can we, I don't have the power to shoot the, finals penalty kick winning the World Cup, but I can, choose to make a better decision in my life according to their archetypes. So what do they have in common, Ari?
What they all have in common, and there's so many more. Ellen MacArthur was that. I mean, it's just on, is that, and I know this sounds Pollyannish, but it's a belief that our best days are in front of us. And that counter to, the doomsday clock ticking down, there's also a clock ticking up. We're at the very, very beginning of the Homo sapien journey. Right? Some people say, oh, we're on the last page of the last chapter. I think we're probably on the last page of the first chapter of what could be a 10 or 12 chapter book, if we decide. And what is going to be obvious to everyone who watches all 6 episodes of the show is every single person I talk to recognizes that, look, it's not all rainbows and unicorns. They're not like, oh, this will be easy. They're all saying, look, this will be tough, but we've done tough things before. And I take us back to where we started. I think about these walks that I used to go on after dinner with my family, especially with my father, and around the block where when we left Mexico, we went to the San Francisco Bay Area and in the suburbs, and we'd walk around the block, and we'd always come up to this giant black oak tree. And at this point in time, this giant black oak tree near where I lived was probably somewhere between 400 and 500 years old. And you take my father, who'd seen the worst of humanity, the worst of what we could do to one another, and he'd always pause and look at this tree in just utter amazement and awe of what was possible, of what this tree had gone through, the winds and the storms to get to this age, recognizing the tree probably has another 100 or 200, maybe even 300 years ahead of it. And That's what everyone on this show had in common. They recognize that we have gone through so much, the worst, but also the best, right? When we think about, sometimes we see these amazing stories when we're hope scrolling of these altruistic acts of service that we do to one another at our best, and recognize that's really who we are. That's what Marty Seligman was getting at. We tell the stories of the worst, but at the end of the day, what has gotten us through the past really 30 to 40,000 years are two things that Homo sapiens do extremely well. We think about the future, multiple futures, that's our scenario planning, frontal cortex, and we cooperate. That's where art comes from, that's where language comes from, that's where families comes from, that's where love comes from. And everyone in the show addresses and lives into that moment, and that's what you will get from the show. That's what I want anyone listening to us right now is to think about my dad, think about that black oak tree, think about the futures that we want, because that is really the first step in moving us towards them, as opposed to moving away from them from a place of fear. It's about how do we move towards those futures and future generations from a place of trust, love, and the desire to see them flourish above all else.
Wow, I can't wait for A Brief History of the Future to air, which airs on Wednesday, April 3rd at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Ari, thank you so much for joining me. I think that, I can discuss with you, again, with many of my guests, but I feel that with you more than others I can speak with you about the future and the past and the present itself, our roots the whole day. But I thank you for joining me today. Maybe this is the first one of many to come.
First of many. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Ari.